encourage them to listen very carefully in the debate, but not to contribute. I'd like to congratulate both teams on making it to this year, the finals of, I suppose we're in November. This is the NYPDL. It's going to be a very fun round, everyone. I am your panel. I will consult with the other two hive minds that I have within my brain to come to some sort of decision, and we'll get somewhere somewhat reasonable. I happen to like pleasantries, so there we are. But I invite the Prime Minister to begin delivering their case in a time frame not to exceed 7 minutes or 30 seconds. Space here.
All right. Give me just 1 second. All right. My oath. Let me know if I cut out or if my Wi-Fi is bad before summertime. And my off-time roadmap is that my roadmap will be on time. All right, this house regrets the social stigmatization of adults living with their parents. I'm proud to affirm. Let's start with some definitions. This house is a reasonable individual. The social stigmatization is tendency of society to look down on adults who live with their parents and view them as inferior. For this house regrets motion, we compare the world in which the stigma exists to the world without the stigma and determine which is better. Some framing: a world without the stigma is one in which people do not want to live with their parents. Adults desire independence in all facets of their lives, as shown through their tendencies to be self-reliant when possible. Adults want to live sexual lives, which is far easier to be done on their own. They desire space, which is far easier on their own. The actual change in the gov world is solely that society looks less down on those who live with their parents, and it does not dramatically change the amount of people living with their parents. So the framework here is the most good for the most people. And I'll start with our first contention: greater financial freedom for the adult offspring. In the status quo, there is a pressure for adults to move out of the house before they graduate in high school, high school or college, depending on what they do. The motion itself tells us there's a societal stigmatization for adults living with their parents. Stigma changes the incentives for an individual. In the gov world, an adult will weigh their options when deciding whether or not to move out. In the end, they will choose what is best for them, because each individual does what they think will benefit them the most. Just like my opponent Julia won't do something that she thinks that she won't be utilitarian for her, Manav won't pass up an opportunity that he thinks will benefit him in a utilitarian manner. Thus, in the gov world, they only move out if that's a net benefit for them, and they only live with their parents if that's a net benefit for them. However, in the op world, there's an additional variable thrown into the decision-making process. In the gov world, the individual will consider their own independence and financial abilities, among other factors, when considering what to do. But in the op world, the individual will also consider what society thinks about their decision. The stigma that the motion references can be defined by Merriam-Webster as a set of negative and often unfair beliefs that a society or a group of people have about something. The op world leads to different incentives because this house will care about the opinions of others. The individual will suffer from societal discrimination as a result of the stigma. The stigma will cause fewer people to be friends with this house, fewer people to consider dating this house, and fewer people to respect this house. We can also look to examples of people caring about what others think in the status quo as like a warrant for people caring about others' opinions. Some people act or dress in a way to make other people think that they are attractive or cool or funny. Many work hard to make others think that they're smart, and some people virtue signal and are performative activists to improve other people's view of them. Now, obviously, not every human action is made for like external validation, but there are a lot of examples of humans doing that, and a lot of humans do care about others' like opinion of them, because the society's valuation of you is dependent on others' valuation of you, and people care about their societal valuation. So in our world, these different incentives do not exist. If the stigma is removed, societal views of this house's education to stay at their parents' house will like not exist and will not affect this house's decision. And here's why that's good, right? So let's take this house doesn't get a benefit from moving out to please others. You don't get a societal boost from moving out of your parents' house, because that's a societal expectation as seen by the word stigma. People will just look down on you if you don't do it. They don't look up on you if you do it. What this house does benefit from, though, is not making bad decisions in the op world because of the stigma and the results of the stigma that I warranted for the past minute and a half or so. In the op world, this house will make decisions that are not actually beneficial to them. To please others, this house could move out when they're not financially capable of doing so. This is a very dangerous decision for two reasons. Reason one is that it's a partially permanent decision. If you buy a property, you spent the money, and you either have a mortgage or you have a lot of your money locked up into a non-liquid asset. If you're in a mortgage, that leads to debt for like 15 to 30 years, which lowers your quality of life because you have a lower disposable income, which could lead to like lack of basic necessities and like lack of spending on things that bring you happiness. When you sign a lease for an apartment, you typically have to give like the first month of rent and the last month of rent as a security deposit. So that's like 2 months of rent that you're never getting back. And on top of that, like sometimes you're locked into the lease for a certain number of years. So you've like committed to spending a lot of money. Now, number two is that it's a waste of money, and which ties into one as well. Money gets unnecessarily spent on rent when it should have been spent on food or clothes or enjoyable activities. This house instead of just doing what's best for them, is now most likely going to like get or buy an apartment or rent an apartment or house. And instead of like doing something that would have made them happier, like spending on food or clothes if they need those, or like doing stuff that is more enjoyable. Side op reduces the quality of life for this house, and we stop that from happening. We stop this house from lacking basic necessities, leading to possible death, and we can guarantee that we improve the quality of life for this house. All right, our second contention is that we improve mental health. The group who disproportionately lives with their parents is twofold: young adults and those in low-income communities. This is the case because young adults are oftentimes in student debt and just beginning their careers, while those in low-income groups aren't able to afford an extra residence, therefore making them live with and care for their parents. The other thing is like people at the beginning of their careers are like receiving entry-level salaries, which are lower because they have less experience. There are two subpoints to this argument. Subpoint A is in the status quo, those who live with their parents do so because they're unable to get another place to live. This stigma exists in the status quo, as the motion tells us, meaning that people move out if they are able to do so in order to avoid the stigma and the negative repercussions of it. This is also seen in how the group living with their parents are disproportionately low-income people. This means the stigma has no benefit for these people. They would already move out of living with their parents if possible and are looked down upon at every opportunity because they live with their parents due to this societal stigma harming them in society. Let's take an example. If you are at the bar and meet someone of the opposite, like so that you are like interested in romantically or sexually or whatever, and desire to take them back to your apartment, they will find it very unattractive if you mention that you live with your parents as a result of the stigma, and will likely not say yes to like your offer. These people are constantly reminded of their inferiority and yet are unable to do anything about it, which will harm their mental health. They will have a greater likelihood of being depressed, a smaller likelihood of finding a significant other, or even friends, because they might be looked down upon, decreasing their happiness and increasing the probability. Oh, like trigger warning. I'll talk about mental health. Stop me if you don't want me to do that. Increasing their probability of like actions of like depression or suicide, because like having friends and not being lonely is like the single most important thing for mental health, because humans are inherently social creatures. And that's like a huge impact on the route. All right, so point B is discrimination against minority groups. In the status quo, the stigma essentially serves to push those minority groups down to the bottom rung of society and provides an avenue for discrimination against them. Those who live with their parents are disproportionately in minority groups in contrast to the general population. Look at how the average wealth of a Black family is substantially lower than that of a white family. And the same applies to other historically discriminated against groups because of the suppression in the past that has taken place against them. This applies at places of employment, for example. If one mentions in the workplace that they live with their parents, they will be looked down upon and feel ashamed. Less employees liking you means less chance of a promotion or a beneficial progress report. Like in our society, there's a stigma, right? So people who live with their parents are like, there's an inherent societal negative view of it. If you mention in an interview or it like slips out or they ask you and you say you live with your parents, that's going to make that person therefore think that you are lesser. As a result, there's a lesser chance that you get that job. The same applies if you're like on trial at a company for a job. You're less likely to be hired if you say that you live with your parents. And people talk about their living situations a lot. People get asked like, oh, like, where do you live? How do you get to school? Or like people will ask you questions about your personal life and you're going to mention the fact that you live with your parents, or like say that you did something with your parents, and that's going to make them think that you're lesser. The same applies to all facets of life. If you return to the bar example from earlier, it provides an avenue for discrimination against minority groups in romantic relationships, for example, as well as just friendships. This means that the stigma reinforces the racial divides that we see in society and increases racial and class inequalities, as people in certain racial groups are far likelier to be living with their parents. Thus, in the gov world, you get increased racial equality, which is clearly net benefit, as well as greater societal equality through classes. And we should be prioritizing racial and class equity over all else, as it's the single most important thing is societal, to address is societal inequality. So for all the above reasons, Judge, I strongly urge you to vote for side government because we improve the quality of life in this House. Thank you.
The panel would like to thank the Prime Minister for his eloquent remarks and now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to deliver the second constructive speech of the round, not to exceed 8 minutes with 30 seconds grace. Hear, hear.
Thank you for the fancy intro. We haven't gotten a lot of those. I'm Julia, she, her pronouns, verbal POIs, and if I have audio issues, feel free to interrupt me. Content warning, maybe mentions of mental health, nothing graphic or anything. All right, everyone ready? Starting time in 3, 2, 1. Two things for my speech. Firstly, op case, then gov case. On op case, two independent arguments from side opposition. Firstly, on social messaging and how this is necessary. Second, on a strain on parents. Firstly, on social messaging, I want to be like really, really clear that narratives and stigmas don't just exist like there is a stigma, so you equally vilify everyone that does this. These things, stigmas and narratives, interact differently with different groups and people in society. We interact with it differently. The important thing to note then is when evaluating this debate, evaluating who uniquely it affects. And I think Gov identifies this, but I think they misidentify who this is. I would say that the most common stereotype that exists towards an adult living with their parents is one of like the deadbeat gamer kid in upper middle class families. Why is that? Basically for all of the reasons that Gov gives you, because there's a bunch of reasons why people might leave their homes. Firstly, that a bunch of people just want to leave for all of the like sexual reasons that Gov gives you. And also like you want to have your financial freedom, you want to have your independence, but also like I'm going to turn this stuff on lower income groups. There's massive incentives for lower income children to leave their family. Firstly, for the reason that they feel guilty. Presumably, if you're lower income, your mom probably is too, in which case it's a massive financial strain on her to continue to sustain you, but also because the living situations of lower income people are probably more strenuous in general, that means it's much harder both emotionally and financially to stay in those situations than to leave. What that ends up meaning is logistically, this narrative affects the like the kind of middle upper class actor more in terms of like whether who actually does it, but also the narrative, because that's the most prominent one. That's the one you see most on TV. I'm sure that's the first one that came to everyone's head. Then, considering that this is the actor that is most affected by this form of social messaging, why is this narrative incredibly important? I think it's really good that if you have this narrative, this is an individual actor that is not 100%, but generally more susceptible to social pressure. Why is that? I think because they don't have a lot of other reasons to stay or go. For all of the reason Govs gives you, the massive incentives like wanting to leave, wanting to be independent, but also not wanting to guilt your family and strain your parents are incentives that don't really exist if you're upper middle class, right? You can have your own freedom to some degree without leaving your parents. You don't feel guilty about staying with them. That means that presumably the only reason why you might leave, if you can like still get a pretty good job and have a car and have some freedom and have probably networking opportunities for your presumably wealthy parents to be able to do this, the only reason why you might have some incentive to leave is if you are things like socially, romantically ostracized for doing that. Why is it incredibly good that this particular actor is one that is affected by this motion? I think that it's probably good for this particular group to leave for the reason that it's really developmentally important for people to leave their families. All of the reason Govs give you, like, I don't think that like 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds or 25-year-olds are doing like equal weighing about like, oh, is it financially advantageous for me to go or leave? I think like you have status quo bias. You're comfy at your parents' house. Like, yes, there are some forces that make you want to leave, but for most people making these decisions, if they have food and housing, things that are things like when you're an adult, you have to deal with, they would want to stay in a situation where they're supported by that. That means that like it's probably good if you leave. It's probably good to develop things like the ability to like take out your own trash, do independence. I think it's probably better for you and for your parents. It's better for your parent-child relationship. The longer you stay with your parents, the worse the relationship gets. That's the reason why like it's like you have more fights with your mom when you're 18 as opposed to 8, because the more developmentally independent you get, the more fights you have over like fundamental things. Like, I don't know, like who can take the car if there are only 2, who can use the TV. Those are fights that are really bad for your relationship, for your future self, for relationships in terms of like caring for your children or grandchildren or all of the relationships that are really important and having meaning in your life. But also it's really good to have financial freedom. All of the things like making your own decisions about buying houses, cars, etc. are really important skills for young adults to develop. And sometimes that requires a little bit of a push. But if these individual actors that don't have a push otherwise aren't getting it, they're not going to do things like get their own job, which means when they're 35 instead of 25 or 18, they're making these decisions, making horrible financial decisions that screw over themselves for all of the reason Gov gives you, because then they buy a house that's bad when they're 30 or 40 instead of when they're 18. I think that means that this is really important for this particular group, that this motion exists because it is an important societal force that presses against them. Secondly, strain on parents. I think that in the absence of social messaging that normalize people from leaving the house, people won't leave, especially the actors I give before. Why is that bad? Firstly, because kids do things like overextend familial resources. The more people are living in your house, the more electricity costs, the more food costs, all of these issues that exist. You have to live in a bigger house, all of these things that exist that the parents have to financially support. What governance characterizes.
Yo, why?
No, thank you. What governance characterizes is not just like, oh, I don't want to buy a house, so I'm going to go with my parents. That financial strain gets transferred to another person. I think that like in terms of net benefits, there's the same amount of like financial strain that exists. It's just on an actor that's worse. Why is that actor worse? Second reason why this is a strain on parents. It particularly afflicts mothers. Why? Because mothers are more likely to have to be influenced by this motion. They're more likely to have to continue to support and sustain you while you're living there for 2 reasons. Firstly, because like there can be single mothers. It's much more like statistically probable there's a single mother than a single father. But secondly, in general, women forfeit more in terms of relationships and parenting in the real like logistical freedoms, but also in their emotional freedom when their children lives with them. That means that like if I'm like a person that's given up my life to raising my child until they're 18 and they stay in my house, not only do I have to continue to support them, but maybe I have to continue to support their children. That means women are much more statistically likely to have to give up literally their entire lives to support children. I think that's incredibly bad. This is a more vulnerable actor. This is an actor that never is able to obtain their freedom again. They didn't consent into this decision because presumably the kid was like, oh yeah, I'm just going to stay with you. And they probably felt guilted into keeping the kid there. It's really bad. But thirdly, parents can't do things they want to do when they my mom wants to like live in a van after we leave. Like my mom won't be able to live in a van if I want to live with her because like I want to have like a job and stuff. I think it's just really bad for parents that want to do things like retire and have goals and aspirations when they feel as though there's a possibility and a likelihood that their kids might be living. It influences the financial decisions they make when they're younger. They spend more time saving for futures they don't even want. I think that's really, really bad for parents. Yeah, I'll take you now.
Okay, you say in your first contention, a bunch of people want to leave for financial freedom, independence, and sexual ideas the Gov tells you. If you get rid of the societal stigma around staying at your parents' house, don't those incentives still exist?
They do, but the point is there's an actor that is not as affected by those incentives, i.e. someone that like probably wants some freedom, but can probably get more freedom. If you have a bigger house, you have more freedom than a smaller one if you're wealthier, but also doesn't feel things like guilt for pressuring their parents. That is an actor that is more likely to stay in their parents' house than one that like feels guilty and that has a smaller house and really wants to escape, or lives in a bad neighborhood and really wants to escape. That's why that actor is more particularly affected. That being said, Gov case. Firstly, on financial freedom, two responses. I think probably the important thing to note is it's like a trade-off, it's not just like, oh, it's really good for the kid for making this financial decision. And I mentioned this earlier, that financial pressure gets transferred towards your parents. I think that's really, really unfair. Maybe it means financial freedom for the kid, but not for the parent. But secondly, it's not equal weighing. Like the kid isn't just like, oh, is this like really like net, like for my absolute future, for my credit score, good for me to buy a job or not, or get a job or not, or whatever. I think probably the kid is more likely to want to stay with their parents if there's not a pressure to do things like they're making a decision that's actively bad for them staying with their parents. It's bad for them developmentally, socially, for all the reasons they give you, but because they have a status quo bias, because they want to be comfy, because they don't want to have to pay for their own house, which is like a big incentive, they're going to stay. Second argument, waste of money, or excuse me, mental health. So firstly, it's not true. Like cross-apply the actor analysis I give you. Secondly, like this is probably important. Like it's not incredibly unique. I just don't think like if someone is like racist against African Americans and they're not dating them, they're not just not dating them because they like live with their parents. They're presumably like massive other societal forces. I just don't think this is ever going to be like the tipping point for solving racial equality. I think that's kind of illogical. My partner would talk about the rest. At the end of the day, this is a narrative that's important for the actors it affects. Proud to oppose.
The panel would like to thank the leader of the opposition for her eloquent remarks and now call upon the member of government to deliver the third constructive speech of the round, also not to exceed 8 minutes with 30 seconds grace. Hear, hear.
Great. Before I begin, my Wi-Fi has been super spotty today. If anything happens, just interject on mute and let me know, and I'll stop having to sort something out. Same thing applies when speaking too fast, but with all of us here, I don't think that'll be an issue. So my partner eloquently put, off-time roadmap will happen on time. Is anyone not ready?
Yeah, is there an overview?
Don't worry about it.
Okay, so it's just on the fly. I don't need an extra piece of paper. Okay, because then I have to do a lot of flipping, and then I'm going to miss things. So, you know.
Yeah, I'm just going to go on the flow. I'm going to go op case, then gov case. Is anyone not ready? Okay, with all that being said, I'll begin my time now. I'm going to jump straight into the case, into the two independent contentions that we get. We start with our first contention. We get this idea of social messaging. We're told the narratives and stigma do not just exist to equally vilify everyone who does something. When evaluating today, we need to focus on who it affects the most, and we get this idea of the middle class and specifically the deadbeat gamer kid. What you're going to get is this idea throughout the entire op case that basically upholds all of their logic that we get, that the person who is affected the most is inside the middle class. Basically, all of the argumentation, all of the analysis that we get on the op side here is dependent on this idea that the actor who is affected the most is this certain middle class kid, and therefore that's the person we should be focusing on the most. And what we tell you is that that's categorically incorrect, and the op side never really warrants why that is the case. We very explicitly and specifically tell you the groups who we tell you are going to be hurt the most by the stigma. We tell you it's going to be young adults, and we tell you it's going to be low-income groups who are disproportionately composed of minority groups. The only warranting that we get from the op for why we're talking about this middle-class people are twofold. Well, firstly, we get this idea that, oh, we have the stereotype of the deadbeat gamer kid, never told why it matters, never told why it happens on a larger scale than the groups that we tell you about. And also, if you just compare our warrants on a very basic basic level. We're talking about large scale groups, and we tell you why it's going to happen on a large scale. If you're talking about something like a middle class gamer kid who, like, for whatever reason doesn't desire independence, that's going to take place on a much smaller scale. The other thing that we get is that the incentives that we tell you about top of case on the prime minister's speech do not apply so much to people in the middle class. So which, even before I go into rebuttals, on a very basic level, that's just mitigation, and those incentives are still there. That means people will still desire to move out if they have the ability to do so. That means that it doesn't really respond to what we tell you. But aside from that, let's look at some of the incentives that my partner gives you earlier on. We tell you, like, people want to be independent, they want to be self-reliant, they want to discover themselves, they want to live sexual lives, they desire space. Those are 5 things off the top of my head that my partner gives you. How many of those still apply to someone who is in the middle class? Guess what? It's all 5 of them, even if it's just to a slightly smaller degree, which we're not even really told why that would be the case. All that we really get is like, oh, they're going to live in a bigger house. That means they can still have more independence. That doesn't mean their, like, parents aren't going to know or care about who they bring over. That doesn't mean they're, like, suddenly going to have everything that they want or anything along those lines, because they're still going to have people watching over them and knowing everything that they do. So those same exact barriers still exist. When we look at the rest of this op case, which I'm going to continue by going into, it's mainly based on that whole assumption that the people who are hurt the most and the actor who is affected the most is that middle class child, which is something that we tell you is categorically inaccurate, as instead it'll be people in low income groups who frankly have no choice but to live with their parents because, quite frankly, they do not have the financial freedom to do so. So, I mean, we never get a warrant on any of this from side op. I'll just say this and then I'll move on. I'll rebut this by saying, like, if all you hear on the topic is that someone lives with their parents, you will equally discriminate against everyone. If you tell someone you live with your parents, they'll judge you. They won't ask why as a result. The idea of, like, the deadbeat gamer kid is not true. We never get a warrant for why that's the biggest piece of this. It affects lower income people and minorities the most because they're the ones that most consistently live with their parents due to a lack of money. So we get this idea that there are massive incentives for lower income people to leave their families because it places the strain on parents, but also makes it much harder emotionally and mentally to live with their parents. Firstly, like, sure, to some degree, but they never engage with the analysis that we give you that very explicitly says that these people do not have the ability to move out in most cases. I mean, with the logic that we get from the LO, op concedes a lot of our analysis. Indeed, placing a strain on your parents and mental and emotional difficulties are a huge reason to leave your parent home. But guess what? Those incentives exist in our world as well. The only lower income people staying at their parents' house right now are those who literally cannot leave their parents' house for financial reasons, and they should not be discriminated against. Once again, there's no warrant for this idea of a middle class actor. We have this idea that the incentives for gov do not really exist if you're in the upper middle class, and the only reason you might leave, presuming you already have some freedom, is things like social and romantic ostracization. A few things here. Children will not just stay at their parents' house and refuse to get a job because they can guilt their parents into doing it, and this is true for a couple reasons. Firstly, individuals want to be fulfilled. Fulfillment brings happiness, which improves quality of life. If they do not get jobs, they will lose a source of fulfillment, which exists in their career, and that'll make you less happy. Secondly, individuals care about their parents. Removing social stigma doesn't mean that kids will just cause their parents to overextend financially, because people are inherently altruistic. People care about their parents because they've been with their parents their whole lives. That means they have an emotional connection to their parents, and they're going to do what their parents want them to do. Thirdly, parents could very easily be an enforcer here. They could motivate or punish their children to get a job and move out as they do in the status quo. Before we move on to their second intention, I want to note that the op side makes a complete assumption here that the parents are going to be covering all of the expenses, when that's something that's never warranted. We're never told why that is the case. I would suggest that the opposite might very well be the case, particularly if parents feel a strain or if they feel pressured to have their kids around. There's a good chance they make their kids end up paying them till now, whether it's in groceries, whether it's in rent, anything along those lines, in order to compensate for all of that, which mitigates these impacts they get on the op side. So on the second condition, we get this idea of a strain on parents. We're told that in the absence of social messaging that encourages people to leave the house, they won't leave. Kids will extend familiar resources. That means more electricity costs, food costs, etc. But you're going to see is that most of the rebuttals I already gave you can just be cross-applied here because it's not really any new analysis or warranting for why that's the case from the opposition. But, like, once again, as my partner said in his POI, I'll quote from the LLC's first contention for a second, that a bunch of people want to leave for financial freedom, sexual, like, independence, and sexual ideas that Gov tells you. If you get rid of the social stigma around staying at your parents' house, these incentives still exist, and op concedes it. That means people still want to be moving out, and they still will be moving out. As my partner tells you, at the very, very top of our case, you're not going to be seeing a substantial increase in the amount of people who move out of living with their parents' houses without the stigma going with the people who live with their parents, that is, if the stigma still exists, because those who want to do it and the societal incentives to do it are still going to exist. My partner asked a POI saying, if these incentives exist in either world, isn't there a huge reason to leave your parents' house in the first place? And the response was yes, but in our world, there's a more effective actor that enforces these incentives on you. Societal stigma does not change the incentives of things like freedom and independence and everything along those lines. Might it exist on, like, a slightly smaller scale because these people have more space, they have, like, a bigger room and a bigger house? Sure, but those incentives very much still degree, and they're still exist, and they're still present. And if anything, the people who we are going to see affected the most, regardless of, like, what populations you buy are the largest in quantity, are going to be the people who are in minority groups, who are in lower income groups, who are young adults, because they're the ones who are in lower income groups that are therefore going to be experiencing the brunt of these challenges in and of itself. So we're told that like Gov mischaracterizes the financial strain getting transferred onto another person. Once again, look at my 3 reasons for why children will still move out. That negates the logic for op second contention, which is basically based on the same logic for the op first contention. We get this idea that this particularly affects mothers and they'll have to sustain you. Once again, this logic on mothers is based on their previous warrants. Because we got rid of their previous logic, that's basically not going to be taking place. What we can basically see is that's going to be entirely mitigated because the amount and the size of that taking place isn't really going to happen, but also the idea that this entire contention is predicated on that idea of the actor being this middle-class child or like this deadbeat gamer kid or whatever we get is simply not going to be true. That's not going to be most of the people we're talking about. And even if we are talking about them in some degree, it's going to be outweighed because firstly, it's a smaller quantity. Secondly, they're going to be affected less. That means we shouldn't be focusing on them as much in the context of this round. My partner also gives you this unresponded to analysis that we should be prioritizing things like racial and class equity above all else is the single most important thing in societal inequality, not touched whatsoever. So that's what we're going under here. Onto the Gov case for a second. We give you our first contention about greater financial freedom for adult offspring. We give you a bunch of different analysis here and we tell you why it's bad for people to end up moving out when they do not have the financial freedom or ability to do so, and why it's going to end up hurting them. And we tell you exactly why they will do this. I mean, my partner gives you the idea that it'll be partially permanent, it'll be a waste of money, and it'll reduce quality of life. We never get a response to most of the analysis here. The only response that we get is like sort of this whataboutism. That's like this financial pressure gets shifted onto parents, and they're making a decision that's bad for them and their parents, but they do it because they have a status quo bias. A few things here. Firstly, living with your parents still means there is a smaller net cost if you view the family as a group as a whole. Children can help cover some of that cost, but it means the family is paying less. That's beneficial for the family. Children could very easily help pay for living costs. Like one family living in one house is cheaper than one family living in two houses because our size significantly reduces rent costs. But aside from that, they never engage with the analysis that we give you here. They're just like, oh, what about this other aspect that's a net negative, for which I've already responded to it, but they also basically concede our contention in doing that. They're also like, oh, they'll stay in the gov role because they don't want to pay. But once again, we tell you there are these incentives in either world to leave. So that's not really going to be a factor. And then onto the second section, we tell you our side improves mental health. We give you 2 subpoints here. Firstly, we tell you about like all of the negative impacts and how it's going to prevent and how it's going to hurt these people with mental health because they're going to be reminded of their inferiority. Secondly, we give you this idea of discrimination against minority groups. On the second point, we get this idea that like there are other massive societal forces to which sure, but discrimination is not a dichotomy at scale, or discrimination is not a zero-sum game. We're still going to be seeing discrimination increase because of this, and it allows people who like to consider themselves as not racist but still do things to do it because they don't inherently view it as discrimination. The point is that it still disproportionately harms these groups, even if it's not conscious. They didn't respond to our first subpoint of this whatsoever. So thank you. I strongly encourage a Gov ballot.
I'd like to thank the member of government for his eloquent remarks and now call upon the member of the opposition to deliver the final constructive speech of the round in a speech not to exceed 8 minutes and 30 seconds grace. And if you would like anything flowed in a different place than where you think I will assume it to be flowed, let me know.
Okay, sounds good. A young adult filled with fear, uncertainty, and doubt is not an actor that can rationally evaluate the net benefits of moving out of their home. First, on who this affects, characterizing why people don't leave, the Gov case, and then back onto the op case. Julia gives you first a bunch of reasoning as to why the people that are affected by the social stigmatization are predominantly upper middle class with the opportunity to leave. What's the response that we get from MG? It's we get no reasoning from opposition and it's categorically inaccurate. I'm just going to repeat the reasoning that we got here. The reason why the societal narrative exists is because people perceive these people who are living in their parents' basement, living in their parents' homes as leeching off their parents and perceiving people as having opportunity but not taking it. Low-income groups don't have the same level of social perception because people understand that they don't have as much opportunity. In addition, like lower income groups are less incentivized to stay in their parents' homes because it's not as nice. They don't have as much opportunity with their parents, and they don't have as much of they feel guilty towards like actually staying with their parents and using their resources. So then I'm like, why don't people move out? Why don't people move out of their parents' basement in the counterfactual in Gov's world? I'm going to give you 5 reasons here. First, that they're afraid to leave the place that they've lived for such an extended period of time. Like people have an irrational fear of leaving their living surroundings. If you wanted to move me or to the house across the street, that's exactly the same. I'd be opposed to it because like I just feel more comfortable in the surroundings that I've lived in. Second, like they don't want to deal with making new friends and new relationships. Like when you move to a new location, like you have to go out and you have to be social, you have to make friends, and that can be scary for some people. Third, that there's a certain complacency that comes with the option for no change. Like people are just in general afraid of change. People are complacent if they have the option to do less work, to take less of a risk. they often take that option because they're fine with being complacent and fine with having no change. Fourth, that oftentimes people don't want to leave because their parents have wealth and they don't want to leave and have their standard of living then cut. Like people are thinking about it from the perspective of like, oh, my parents drive a nice car, I get to drive that car. If I move out, I don't get to drive that car. Like that's the perspective. And fifth, that they want to stay in their like existing neighborhood. They have people they know there. That's like pretty intuitive. What they try to characterize it on government then is that people are just sitting there and rationally evaluating like how they'll achieve financial independence through staying with their parents. That's not what's going on at all. They're irrational reasons that people use to justify staying with their parents because they can not weigh, oh, this is a risky endeavor, but it might pay off. They just see the risk. They see the play. They've been living their lives have been with their parents for such an extended period of time that they then justify staying with their parents as there's less risk by me going by me staying with my parents. Why is this then important? Because these irrational incentives that make people stay with their parents exist on both sides of the house. But on our side, what we get is a countervailing social narrative that then encourages people to leave. This is broadly positive for the reasons that both sides agree on. Like both sides talk about how their sexual and social relationships are improved under our side of the house, or if people leave, which happens under our side of the house. We talk about how independence is broadly good. I think this is something that's agreed on by both sides. I think it's broadly positive for people then to leave. What are the then two clashes in this debate that I think are really important? First, on the effects of this perception being negative, and then do you get people to leave? So first on who this affects. I think that the people who have the perception hurt them the most are the people who actually are benefited the most by this by having this perception, like because of the fact that the people who are being affected are predominantly upper middle class, because the people who are being focused on by this social stigmatization are predominantly upper class, it incentivizes those people who have an opportunity to at some point leave to prepare to leave. Like when I'm in high school and I'm 15 and 16, for example, it's more likely that if I don't see staying with my parents as an option, I then go out and try to work harder to prepare myself for the real world. This is like a bunch of impacts. Like it means like people might study harder in school, people might like care more about like their future, but it also means like small material things that improve the quality of life for everyone. Like kids might want to learn doing their own laundry or learn how to cook because they can see in the future, okay, I don't want to live with my parents. I don't want to be like one of these kids who are living with their parents. Therefore, I have to learn some things that make me independent, and I have to start helping around the house. That broadly helps parents, that broadly helps the kids in the future as well. Then on like, even if it does affect, like let's take them at their best and let's say that it affects low-income people as well. Why is this then not that important? Because these people are already it's just diminishing marginal returns. These people are already so socially stigmatized that these people are already so socially stigmatized that this additional social stigma doesn't actually affect them that much, and they still have a comparable level of entering the job force, not being socially stigmatized. But it's outweighed by the second major point of clash on whether we get people to leave. We give you a bunch of reasoning as to why you then get more people to leave on our side of the house. It mostly goes conceded. What is that reasoning? It's that people, despite having maybe a better calculus for leaving, despite having the opportunity to leave, don't take it because they're afraid of change. They're afraid of having to work. They don't take that opportunity. It's an important point of development for them to actually take that risk and move out. I think like also we shouldn't be afraid to point out that some of these people who have this opportunity are those who then who in the like some of the people who have this opportunity won't take it in the counterfactual because they simply see it as the easier path, the path of less resistance. Like I don't have to do as much work if I'm living with my parents because they'll pay for certain things. I don't have to like take on as strenuous of a job. I don't have to study as hard. That's like that's the type of thing that happens in the counterfactual. First on the thing about like sometimes kids pay for some of the expenses. I think like that's like maybe true that sometimes they pay parents for living expenses. I don't think it's I think like we're just going to counter assert here and say that most often it's not like most often they don't pay their parents for anything, and even if they do, it's probably not for the full amount or strain that they put on their parents. Like it's not even just a monetary strain that they put on their parents, it's a time strain, it's an attention strain. Their parents have to worry then about what's happening to their kids in a
Manav, pause for 1 sec.
Okay, try talking. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Okay, I can hear you. So the last thing that I heard was you were responding to like the children can split costs thing, and you were saying you were going to counter assert something. I didn't hear the assertion.
Okay. Do you know what my time was when you stopped hearing?
I have no freaking idea.
Okay. Well, just whatever.
Only with 1 minute, 20 seconds left.
All right. That's about what I have. Okay. We're just going to counter assert and say that like it's probably not true that in the majority of cases that the parents are being paid for living expenses by their children. I think in the majority of cases that the kids are actually just paying for, the kids are being paid for by their parents. And even in the cases where it does, like even in the cases where they do pay for some portion of living expenses, it's not the entire monetary value. But I think even then, it's just a time strain that they put on their parents as well. Like the parents have to give them attention and time in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. It kind of messes up the parents' plans. Like I can give you reasoning as to why parents do this, because they feel obligated to their kids, because there's a social expectation for you to care for your kids. So they're very likely to actually pay for their kids and pay for their living expenses and allow their kids to live in their house, even if the kids aren't paying for anything. And the kids are incentivized to not pay their parents if they don't have to. So that's very likely. So then if we get people to leave, why is it broadly good? Because both sides agreed until MG, and when MG flipped and declares that it's not actually good. Yeah, there's less money spent if you live with your parents, and you might drive a nicer car. But I think relationships, living your life, are far easier to do when you're living by yourself. That's broadly far more beneficial than like some material goods. Like the things that you get by living by yourself, having independence, are far more impactful. So proud to oppose.
Yes, the panel would like to simultaneously recognize the MO for his eloquent remarks and also apologize for various technical difficulties that happened to affect all three panel members at the same time. And with that, the panel wishes to recognize the leader of the opposition to deliver the first non-constructive speech of the round. The speech shall not exceed 4 minutes and 30 seconds. And while new examples are certainly welcome, new argumentation is not. Obviously, I invite the government to call points of order. I am 9 times out of 10 going to ask for some back and forth. I will guide that back and forth, and then I will adjudicate after, unless I'm like really sure for some reason as to what I think about it, but that probably won't happen. And I'm not going to repeat all this for the PMR, but it's the same thing.
All right, and for the sake of paper you should write it on, just write it on your ballot. This will be your RFD. All right, everyone ready? All right, starting time in 3, 2, 1. 2 things in the speech. Firstly, which actor is affected. Secondly, why moving out is good for that actor. Firstly, who's affected? Gov says poor people are affected because a bunch of incentives exist. Yes, that's true. Those incentives those incentives exist. They don't exist symmetrically for everyone. What we prove is incentives to be independent exist on both sides. But here's the reason why poorer people are much more likely to naturally want to leave and naturally not want to stay. Firstly, parent guilt. Presumably, if you're pretty poor, your parent probably is too. It's probably a massive financial strain. This means you probably feel guilty for staying. Your parent might literally kick you out because they're like, we literally can't support you. Secondly, life at home probably sucks. You probably live in a neighborhood that's not incredibly safe, not incredibly prosperous. There's not not a lot of financial opportunities. Maybe you just live in a tiny house. Those are all reasons you would more want to leave if you're impoverished than not. But also, like, let's be clear. It's probably not true that if we're considering that the only actor in this debate that is impoverished, that is staying at home, is an actor that is so poor they cannot leave their home, which is probably only true in the US anyway, that actor probably has way bigger problems to worry about, in which case this motion probably isn't relevant. What that ends up meaning is there is an actor in this debate that is disproportionately affected by this narrative. Poorer people are much, much more influenced by incentives that make them want to leave their home. Those incentives, the incentives to want to leave a house that's not that nice, to feel guilty about straining your financially poor parents, don't exist for wealthier kids. What that ends up meaning is they're making decisions more based on narratives than they are on incentives. That means wealthier kids are more likely to be affected by narratives, by stigmatization, than incentives, because you care more about the hookup that you're doing than your ability to support yourself in your family. That means it's much more likely that wealthier kids are affected by this narrative way disproportionately. Then why is it good that these this actor is moving out of their family's house or is affected by this narrative. For all of the reasons Manav gives you, they're probably likely to stay without this narrative. Aside from the independence, like the mechanization Gov gives us, like thank you, all of the reasons why you're afraid to leave, those are things that disproportionately affect wealthier people for all of the reasons I give before. Then why is it good that they leave? Firstly, because it's probably good to do things like be a young adult independently in the world with your own house. We would contest that it's not bad financially to buy a house. It's crucial, it's necessary to existing as a human being. It means you develop skills like doing your own laundry, existing as an independent person, not straining your family, developing skills like learning, like developing a credit score because you have your own house, learning how to like do finances, learning how to pay mortgage, manage your money are absolutely crucial skills that it's better that you do younger. They're absolutely crucial, especially for actors in this particular group, but also it massively strains your parents if you stay at home. For all of the reasons that Manav gives you and I give you, your parent probably will keep you there. They're probably going to let you stay. What that ends up meaning is it massively strains your parents' future to the extent that they're not able to do things that they want to do, especially mothers, because they feel more of a moral and emotional obligation to care for you, to potentially care for your children, which massively restrains their future autonomy, their ability to make any decisions. They've already given up 18 years of their life at least to caring for you. Now they have literally no more. But also it's just probably bad for your parent relationships. Like in any instance, if you're a 25-year-old living with your like 65-year-old parent, that's super bad for your relationships. That means weigh this firstly on vulnerability. The parents are an actor in this debate that don't consent into this decision, at least not entirely. They're emotionally coerced. What that means is, especially for mothers, it's unfair that they're affected by your financial and emotional strain. On scope, and on magnitude, because this is an actor that massively strains the relationship, their happiness, but on time frame, it's probably bad if there's a whole generation of people that is not developing the skills to be able to exist independently, to have their own house, to have financial resources. What that ends up meaning is you want to have these individual actors, you want to have these actors that are staying home with their parents, being productive in the economy, knowing how to work their finances, but also the mental health of them and their parents when you have bad relationships. We win this debate because we prove that this actor is the one that's affected. We prove that staying at your house is a bad financial decision, it's a bad emotional decision, and that we would preferably have a narrative that pushes this actor out to go into be independent, to take risks, to make money, etc. Proud to oppose.
Panel would like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for eloquent closing remarks, and now I invite the Prime Minister to deliver the final speech of the round, not to exceed 5 minutes and 30 seconds grace. Everything that I said about TOOs still apply. Yeah, let's go.
All right, I'll start my time. Actually, I'll start my time now. Clarifications, couple voter issues, weighing. My opponents tell you incentives do not exist symmetrically for everyone, the opposite tells us, to which, yes, we agree, but guess what? Impacts do not exist equally for everyone. I'll get into that later when I do some weighing. Judge, we get a weird MO speech in this round in that it doesn't do any line by line, focuses entirely on the big picture, and spends 3 to 4 minutes on the actor debate. I'm frustrated as a debater by this actor debate. I imagine you're frustrated as a judge too. I think we can agree that both the low income and minority analysis we give you as a gov and the middle class analysis you get from op exist to some degree, but we never get any reason from the op on why theirs is more important or any rebuttal to why our analysis exists in the first place. They do no weighing in the last speech. What do we tell you in the MG speech? We outweigh because ours is A, on a larger scale because we apply to larger groups of people, B, better warranted since we explicitly tell you why these people consist mostly of the people unable to move out, and C, these people have larger impacts because they have less choices and are hurt more. We get a faint idea of diminishing returns that's never warranted, and the op side holds people down by preventing them from getting jobs and moving up, which is never touched. I'll talk more about that in weighing, but what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, in the next few seconds, I'll clarify the round and what specific cases we're arguing about and the relevant scenarios in the voters. So there are some people who will not move out, who will move out either way, who don't have any impact in the round, right? Because if they move out in the gov world, they don't get a benefit. And if they move out in the op world, they don't really they just get the same exact benefit. So it doesn't change anything. But there are 2 specific cases, and that's the 2 voters. Voter 1 is people who will move out in the op world, but won't move out in the gov world, right? And that's my opponent's whole case, basically. And what I'm going to try to convince you of here in this voter is that this is very few people, as we've been doing throughout the round. There are a couple of reasons for that we bring up throughout this round, which go largely unrefuted, but I'll rebuild our analysis and extend on it. Reason 1, individuals want to be fulfilled. Fulfillment brings happiness, which improves quality of life. If these people don't get jobs, they lose the source of fulfillment, which is their career. That applies to the whole gamer middle class kid example. If you're less fulfilled, you are less happy. That is one reason. Reason 2, individuals care about their parents. Kids aren't mean to their parents for no reason, which straining their parents for no reason, just to be lazy, would be mean, as we see for most kids trying to have a positive relationship with their parents. There are very few kids who are intentionally mean to their parents who get no benefit out of it. Removing societal stigma doesn't mean that kids will just cause their parents to overspend financially. 3, parents can be the enforcer. They could motivate or punish their children to get a job and move out as they do in the status quo. We get this whole actor thing, but like the best actor is the parents, right? Because parents are the main enforcer for most of child's lives. They set rules, etc. So they're in a uniquely beneficial position to be the actor and the enforcer. If parents see their children as being lazy and not leaving because they don't have a job, they will force them out of the house. This is especially true if it's really important that the kid leaves the house. So the extreme cases that OP talks about are rebutted and mitigated by this. Case 4, reason 4, individuals value independence. Adults desire independence in all facets of their lives, as shown through their tendencies to be self-reliant when possible. Like, I'm self-reliant as much as possible. I'm sure you are too, Judge, and I'm sure my opponents agree. Adults want to live sexual lives, which is far easier to be done on their own. They desire space, which is far easier on their own. What we see overall is there is not a significant large group of people that will decide to not move out after we pass this plan. And in the cases where staying is the most harmful, individuals are most likely to leave either way. All right, voter issue 2, people who would not have moved in either world. That's like the impacts of our case. That's our offense. Let's look at the people who can move in either world. Those are going to be predominantly lower income people. OP gives you many reasons for why poor people want to leave the most. But here's the issue. If you're very poor, you literally cannot move out. You can't pay rent and buy food and pay for electricity and other basic necessities if you don't have money. OP's stance on this is essentially like, if you're homeless, buy a house, which is pretty ridiculous. OP says that those who are really poor and can't afford to leave is a small population. That's like completely false. The minimum wage in America is $7.25 right now. If you think that you can afford like the down payment on a house and mortgage, or like the first and last month of rent, or just like any basic necessities with that, that's pretty ridiculous, especially like the first part of your career when maybe you still have student debt. OP also tells you that these people don't get affected very much because they have bigger problems. Mental health is still very important. I'll continue on that later. Mental health is a serious problem for everyone, especially loneliness. Like, if you have like mental problems, or if you're depressed or suicidal, like death equally affects everyone, and so does depression. Look to the logic in our second contention, which goes basically unrefuted, other than narratives and stigmas do not just exist do not just exist to equally vilify everyone who does something. To which I'll say, all you hear on this topic is that someone lives with their parents. You will equally discriminate against everyone. If you tell someone you live with your parents, they'll judge you. They won't ask why as a result. We get one idea from the OP that says, oh, the stigma doesn't exist for people who can't move out because people know that they can't move out. That is absolutely not true. You do not know how wealthy everyone is. I don't know how wealthy the members of this round are. Like, I don't know how wealthy members of my school are. In the future, I won't know how wealthy my coworkers are, but I will know whether or not they live with their parents. So everyone's equally like negatively impacted by this. So the second out voter, so our offense outweighs the first voter, which is their offense, because the second voter specifically controls the possibility for societal change. In my PMC, I give you a line of analysis that reads, we should prioritize racial equity over all else, as it is the single most important thing in this round is societal inequality. Is this a well-warranted line? No. Is it ever refuted? Also no. Our side is the only side that solves racial inequality. But I also want to talk about like how our side is the only side that like controls future change, which is actually a well-warranted idea, because like, think about this. If you have like mental health issues due to the societal stigma of being forced to stay at home, that's going to keep you down. That's going to stop you from being productive because you're sad and you're lonely, and that reduces your happiness and therefore your long-term productivity. It also like reduces your chance to form friends, get promotions, and like get jobs in the first place if you're poor, which like OP never refutes, other than this widespread, like this general idea of blanket rebuttal of like, oh, like this doesn't equally affect everyone. In a job interview where the person like only talks to you for 15 minutes, they will equally discriminate you against as everyone else. And like at a job too, that affects your promotion and future career prospects. So because we outweigh on like lives saved and improved in the long run, I strongly urge you to vote for us. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna turn off my video, do some thinking. I'll consult virtually with my other panelists, and then I'll come back and deliver RFD. Okay.
All right, thank you.
Great, thank you, and
guys.
good round to the other guys too. Yeah.
Yep, good round, guys.
I'm going to get my water. I will be right back. If there are people who have stepped away who you want to be here for the RFD, you can get them here. My intuition on out-round RFDs, by the way, is that I don't really go as much speech by speech as I do otherwise. However, if I get through the first part of the RFD and we've gotten through the reason for decision in the round, and you still want to hear individual feedback, or you want to like talk to me after the round in a somewhat more private setting and just talk through individually your speech, I'm also more than happy to do that. So I just want to say that this is somewhat different than how an in-round RFD would look, but I think that there's still util for you to be gained, even though, spoiler alert, util, question mark, but I'll get my water. My pen just fell off my tape. Okay. So, I vote Westfield.
That was quite.
Congratulations to Trinity for making it to finals.
Rada, I think you cut out.
Rada, you did cut
Sorry?
out, yeah.
You cut out.
Oh, did I
like,
cut out? Oh,
to
that's
say the decision. It was very anticlimactic. So
Oh, I actually really apologize. That actually really sucks. No, so I vote op. So congratulations to Westfield and congratulations to Trinity for making it to finals. I think this RFD is long, and the reason why it's long is because there's genuinely very little warrant level clash between different claims that I get. So I have to do a lot of like thinking in terms of how I think that these claims interact in terms of groups of people. So let me go through this round. The first thing that I try and figure out is I try and figure out like what sort of impacts I care about the most, or which impacted groups I care about the most. I think that there are largely three characterizations I get in the round that are somewhat important. The first blip at the top of PMC is util. This is dropped, never said again, no side agrees on this, I don't care. The second argument that I get also in the PMC is that we should have some ability to care about groups that have been oppressed societally, and I think the warrant given is some form of like historically based oppression. Fine. And the link there is that Gov wants me to care about, it's really unclear whether we're talking, by the way, about people who are disadvantaged as account of their socioeconomic status or people who are disadvantaged on account of their race. And I think there's some link that you give between race and socioeconomic status in terms of historical oppression that's somewhat well taken. The third notion in terms of people that I should care about in the round comes out of the LOC, and I think is also extended through the LOR, just as the argumentation from the PMC is in the PMR, which is this argument about consent. And this we get, which I was really waiting for a gender-based collapse, by the way, in the LOR that I never got about mothers. But I think the argument in terms of like consenting into systems is something that we should care about, and we should try and protect those who do not consent into a system, is at least a competing notion of groups of people that we should care about in the round. I don't think that collapse is particularly clear in the LOR, and I don't think I'm given a way to say reorder these groups in that dimension particularly cleanly, but I think that could be a very interesting way to make the round somewhat better. Okay, so at this point, I'm left thinking that I probably care about these groups of people that Gov wants me to care about, and I should look probably at the sort of organization of the last speech in terms of understanding exactly what the effects on these groups of people are. Okay, so then we go to the PMR. I have notes here from the PMR. Okay, so this group of people, to be clear, is the second thing that the PMR says, is the second group of people that we're caring about, which is the group of people who can't move in either world. PMR says it's probably not a small group, it's probably a large group. Fine, I buy that. Mental health matters. Fine, I buy that. I can explain why I buy these things, but I think the notion that it's large is much more intuitive than the notion that it's small. I'm not going to give any countervailing warrant. And I think that both sides agree that the mental health of these people matter. Op accesses these arguments in terms of like, well, we think that like being able to have friends and that sort of thing is helpful to your own personal psyche. And Gov certainly agrees. So that's why I don't think there's much clash on the mental health point. Lorenzo is correct in pointing out that the argument that prima facie beats this is in the MO, which is this like perceptual opportunity argument. So you're right to respond to that, Lorenzo, because if you don't, this would be a very short RFD, and I would say OP wins right there. I think this is sort of mishandled, though. And I think that there are two cases that we should consider. The response that I get from the PMR is, this is path dependent upon being able to perceive that this person is a member of this group. This is a really big problem, because I think that although this is probably true for some class-based portion of this argument, I don't think that this is true for a race-based portion of this argument, or at least the intuition pump that I can determine whether sort of what race someone is in is much stronger than the intuition that I can determine what class someone's in. So I think that OP does have ground here in terms of beating back some of the rhetoric concerning racial stigma or racial groups. Then what I'm left with is this notion in terms of that say these people are still going to be judged if they're part of these lower socioeconomic classes. The problem is the way that this is impacted in the Gov case is that this results in temporal things like them not getting a job or them being looked over for some sort of promotion, or there's some sort of like teleological end in terms of making more money. At least seems to be the assumption that I'm given from Gov case, which I don't think interacts with a lot of countervailing rhetoric from the op block in terms of what people actually care about. And I think at worst, probably knifes with like Ben's argument concerning fulfillment, because it's really not clear why your characterization of fulfillment in terms of like being hired for specific jobs is the same as what Ben wants you to believe fulfillment means, which I think is quite different. And I think that insofar as we're talking about things like having sex a lot, or having a lot of friends, or engaging in these sorts of meaningful relationships, I think that this group of claims is quite distinct from the group of claims concerning making more money. However, I'm also not really happy to vote here, and the reason is I don't think the weighing that I just stated is present enough in the op block in terms of like this comparative for me to buy it. I think there is an argument from MO, which gets me about 75% of the way there. So if there's no better place to vote, I think this is where. But I think the problem is that there's no response to the extension that the MO gives, which is, there's going to be an incentive for other people to work on, say, tangible skills, right? Like they're going to attend more study halls, or they're going to study harder when they're in middle school or something like this. I don't think this is warranted particularly well, by the way. I think it's warranted well enough for me to buy it's true. And I think it's a really smart argument because it gives an extra bite to what you're saying. I think insofar as this is true, I have two competing notions, right? One, which is that people in this group is going to have a more difficult time getting jobs because of voter oppression. There's some mitigation done by OP in terms of like, we don't think this is the bright line at which these people are going to be oppressed or not. I think on weighing is probably somewhat mitigatory, but there's still some amount of like bite here left to Gov's offense. But then what I get is, but they have some path to like work on these in the future. So I think on that level, it becomes very unclear to me who I buy here. And this is why I'm fine defaulting back. Like I don't have an understanding, like probably it's true that this affects more people in terms of more people going to hall, but it's unclear whether like the magnitude of this impact is greater or less than like, is this the bright line at which point someone gets a job or not sure. But this means that I'm probably fine going back to the arguments concerning relationship building and that sort of thing being more important than money, which I think is weighing that is present in MO and then extended in LOR. The next thing that I value, so let's call it 75% confident voting there, but I think that I want to evaluate the rest because I think that there are arguments concerning, say, consent, especially in terms of the way that parents opt into consent that are important to evaluate. Like it's theoretically true that Gov wins that, and then I'm in some sort of weighing battle. So then I go to the first thing that Lorenzo tells me, and I think here I'm stealing Lorenzo's organization because I think it's how I would organize an RFD regardless. It's that sort of the small group of people who is going to move, the group of people who is going to move out in the op world, but not move out in the Gov world. Lorenzo tries to convince me that this is, say, a small group of people. There are three reasons that we get. The first is this notion that is from Ben's speech that they want to be fulfilled. The second is that they care about their parents. And the third is that the parents can be the enforcer. The problem here is I think OP spends 6 minutes of the MO convincing me, one, that these people are not at all rational, and two, gives me, I can count them, but I'm pretty sure it's 5. Hold on. 5 reasons as to sort of how the irrational decision-making flows the other way. So that being said, I don't think the argument that they want to be fulfilled I think you have to respond to whether or not they're going to be a rational actor. Because I think even if I buy that they want to be fulfilled, I don't necessarily buy that the decision that they make will link into their want for fulfillment, right? Insofar as the decision is irrational. The second thing, in terms of caring about their parents, I think you need to respond. Like, I think that this is now a competing notion as to what I should care about. And I think that the irrational claim is that you care about not changing. And there are a lot of reasons to care about not changing in terms of friends, in terms of all these things. So I think there are at worst like competing notions of what we care about, and it's probably likely that this isn't a turning point at which people leave or not. And then the third thing, which I think is probably the strongest argument from the Gov block on this point, or the Gov bench, is that parents can be the enforcer. The problem here is I think this doesn't engage with the warranting I get from OP as to what the parents' incentives are, especially the argument that I think is clean extended through the OP bench, which is that the parents have incentives to sort of give in to any pressure of their kids because the parents want to support their kids in sort of whatever way that means. And I think the characterization that I get that like, aha, the parents may want to live in a van, I think is the example in the round, but can't do that because there's, children are in the house and they prioritize their children's well-being over that is reasonably compelling for me. And I don't think you can then say, but that means that like the parent is going to start doing these things that the child won't like in terms of teaching them, right? I think that argument would probably have to be made. So at that point, I'm like reasonably convinced that there is a group of people who is going to be uniquely motivated to move out if the stigma exists for the reasons largely that are present in the OP block, in the MO, and then extended in the LOR. So I think that these people don't move out. They don't move out if the stigma does not exist, and they do move out if the stigma exists, which means that I buy that like we're hurting mothers or we're hurting the group that does not consent into this, or like it's on that bad. So I think it ends up that OP wins both of these levels of clashes, but I think Gov comes pretty close to beating the most disadvantaged groups argument, which given the weighing in the round, I think is enough to win them the round, but doesn't necessarily come far enough on the other part of this, which makes sense because the weighing outweighs. So I can take any questions. I don't know how convoluted that was. This is like my 6th RFD in 14 hours. So there you go.
No, thank you. And congrats, guys.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I'm good. Thanks.